Tonight we have here the author of a new book, Daniel Walkowitz, Professor Walkowitz. For us, it is not the first lecture to host in Lviv, and it is a pleasure for us to have Professor Walkowitz coming here to Lviv multiple times, not only to write this book, but also to share the previous research achievements back in 2015. The topic of the lecture that he had here and the film screening was about a very different aspects, but no less important and no less complicated and complex topic of the Donbass. In the mid-1990s, Professor Walkowitz wrote a book about the history of the Donbass and about the protests and the protests of the 1980s that we might claim contributed to the changes in the country and to the collapse of the Soviet Union as well. The working history, public history, new approaches to history, these are the topics that Professor Walkowitz has studied over the many years of his work at the universities in the USA, mostly at New York University, where he has worked for many years at the Faculty of History and has curated the public history program as well. Also last time, well, we have a colleague, Volodymyr Sklokin from the Ukrainian Catholic University. Professor Walkowitz was telling us about the beginnings of the public history as a field of research in the USA. It might seem very unexpected, but this shift to Jewish history and even Jewish heritage seems to be new, but not new at the same time for Professor Walkowitz. And the book that we see tonight is about the remembered and the forgotten Jewish history, the Jewish heritage of this region. Each of us probably has experienced, and each of us probably read something about the Jewish history and Jewish heritage of this region in different ways. So it would be very interesting for us to learn about the broader context and also about the ways of approaching the history and Jewish heritage and heritage tourism in the current world. So this is about Professor Walkowitz, but in the second part of this presentation we will have Marla Osborn and Jay Osborn, who have many times visited Lviv and Poland several years ago. Marla, if you can please show yourself. Marla and Jay have been for 3 years. Have been for 3 years almost living in Lviv, but before that they have come multiple times here to Lviv and to the city of Rohatyn. They have lived several years in Poland. Before that, Jay was an engineer and Marla was a lawyer in California. And it is a very long journey from California to Lviv that hasn't started initially as the road with Lviv as a destination. However, this is the exclusive and exceptional experience on how to come, not only how to come to the city or to the town of the ancestors, but also how to work with this heritage as descendants. So in the second part of this presentation, Marla and Jay will join us, but we shall start with the lecture of Professor Walkowitz. And you can see the title of this presentation on the screen. And I will say no more and pass the floor to Professor.
Take this one, this one. this working?
Yes.
Thank you, Sophia. It is always wonderful to be back here and to the center, which does such actually pioneering and important work here, but work that resonates around the world. It's a center that's very well recognized and an important place. So thank you so much for inviting me back. I should say, just by way of introduction, that this book, which is about Jewish heritage tourism, could as easily be about, in the United States, slave monuments, slave memorials. It is actually an interrogation about the relationship between history and memory, what gets remembered, what gets forgotten, and who gets to tell the story, who gets to decide what's remembered and what's forgotten. So all of this gets brought together. This particular project, though, comes out of my own personal history. We all travel with suitcases, with baggage, with valises, but of course I want to talk about the other baggage that we bring with us. Stories, ideas, experiences that shape our expectations of the places to which we travel. My stories are shaped by my experience with my grandmother on my father's side, my paternal grandmother. Her husband, my paternal grandfather, died when I was a baby. I heard wonderful stories about him, but never really knew him. My grandmother, her name, I knew her as my Buba Chaya. Her name was Ida Lubertovsky Walkowitz. She is an imposing woman, third from the right-hand side in the middle. In front of her is my grandfather, Zisha. The person sitting on his lap was my Uncle Joe, and to his left, that's my father, Solomon. This was taken around 1921. They had just arrived in Paterson, New Jersey, from Copenhagen, where they had spent 7 years waiting for the war to end. They had left Vuj in Yiddish. Easy to remember. You know, remember that the city is the center of the Polish film industry, so we say Hollywood. So it's Vuj. So that's where they're from. I knew relatively little about my grandmother. She only spoke Yiddish. I didn't. I was always sent to Jewish school, and I always, much to my great regret now, never really learned the language. So we didn't speak very much. I only knew stories about her. She was sick for much of her life as I was growing up as a teenager. She died when I was about 17 years old. The story I heard was that she was a Bundist and secular. She was what we would call democratic socialist, involved in Yiddish culture, a Yiddish culture that was vibrant, as her husband, Zisha, had been as well. I was also told that her husband, Zisha, always complained that she was never home to do the cooking because she was always getting arrested. And I think I never appreciated then what I do now, that made her doubly revolutionary. She was a revolutionary as a socialist, and she was a revolutionary as a woman. They both became important to the story as I came to learn. I knew very little, though, beyond that. I do always remember that I always imagined myself as walking in her footsteps. I was growing up in the 1950s and 1960s in the United States, I was an activist. I was, in a small way, a freedom rider, a peace activist, a Civil War activist. And I always imagined that I was doing the kind of political work and social movement work that my grandmother had done as a Bundist. But more than that, I didn't know. But it was a period in the 1950s in which it was very much thought to be pretty much impossible to talk about a socialist or communist past. I was what was known, what we now know, it was a red diaper baby. That meant that my parents, until 1956, the Hungarian Revolution, were in the Communist Party. They then left it, and they became really kind of democratic socialists. But until then they were, but it was a life as a red diaper baby you didn't talk about. You didn't go to school and share with people those kinds of politics. You'd be censored. So it was a history that was hidden. And I knew that somehow I wanted to go out and make sure that history was not hidden in the future. So I decided to embark on heritage tourism, to see what in commercial heritage tourism were the stories that were told or not told. Could I hear stories of people like my grandmother? Would I hear something of that socialist world, of that world of Yiddishkeit, a world that was involved in Yiddish theater, folk choruses, journalism, the arts? It was a world in which I had been reared, even in a non-Yiddish speaking world, doing Jewish theater myself. So I set off. But at the time that I set off, about a decade ago, I started reading a lot of Jewish history and what did we know, and I discovered two things that were less important for me going forward. One, I went to the various cities that I was going to visit and discovered there was a very rich Jewish history that Jewish scholars had already written about and uncovered. And it was a history that went back almost 1,000 years in many places. In New York and London, not so long, but in these parts of the world, 700, 600, 700, 800 years. In Poland, Warsaw, 1,000 years. And it was a complicated history. It wasn't a history just of the rich. It was a history of the rich and the poor. It was a history of the secular and the religious. It was a history of many different kinds of religious groups. And they often fought with anti-Semites in the community, in the cities, but they also fought amongst themselves. So it was a very rich history. That was one thing I knew. There was this very rich history. The second thing that I knew, I can't remember. What was the second thing that I knew? I'm blanking for a second, my goodness. Oh, of course, I knew what it was. I learned that the history that existed, the Holocaust tourism that existed, was tourism that existed was mostly Holocaust tourism. That since 1967, after the Six-Day War, increasingly heritage tourism had become obsessed and concerned with the need to talk about the Holocaust because Israel was now vulnerable, and it was important to demonstrate that Israel, the vulnerability, need to be secured and protected by remembering the Holocaust, that that could happen again, and that Israel was a refuge. So increasingly that became the story. And I went to places like in this picture, in Warsaw, in front of the monument in Israel, in Warsaw, and found that there were groups like this of Israeli children that were being sent by the education ministry on trips, and they would go to a concentration camp, stand in front of the memorial, and again, not unlike many of us, very few of us, I suspect, traveled with national flags, but the Israeli children came with a national flag and stood in front of it. And then they went back to Israel. For American tourists, or English tourists, and others, which were, again, the diaspora people who had left places like Lviv, and Jews who had left places like this had gone to Israel, but they'd also gone to England and the United States. They went on marches of the living. And those marches, again, which were funded by various NGOs, charities in the United States, went initially to a concentration camp, Birkenau, Auschwitz, and then to Israel, again, to make clear that connection between those two sites. So when I began this tourism, I discovered that Holocaust tourism was the coin of the realm. It was the nature of the tourism. And they saw these places as graveyards. Places like the Lower East Side in Manhattan or the East End in London were sites that they went to see a kind of living heritage from their ancestors from the 1880s to the 1920s. They imagined these places as graveyards where their ancestors had been exterminated, and there was places for mourning. And that's all. So that's how I began this project. And I decided I started by going to the village where this grandmother had lived, Amshinov. And I went there and discovered there was a cemetery. The cemetery was not accessible from the town very easily because, well, many of you know the wonderful new airport in Lviv. That airport was built because they had gotten funding to help to sponsor with Poland the Euro Cup, which was, you know, the soccer matches. And they not only built a new airport, but they built superhighways. And the superhighway from Krakow to Warsaw simply cut off the cemetery from the rest of the town. So you could get to the cemetery if you were willing to risk your life crossing a superhighway, or you would have a several-mile detour to go around to where the cemetery was. That's where it was, and of course, there was virtually nothing in the cemetery to be seen any longer, but some gravestones that could now be recovered, but that was all. The town itself had no markers. I hoped I would go there and I'd see a big sign that would say, "Welcome to Walkowitz Street" or Lubertovsky Street. Not to be. What I did see were old buildings that I could imagine might have been the kind of buildings people lived in. And I've since been told that the small building on the right in the back was in fact the mikveh, the Jewish ritual baths. But there was no historical markers. There was no way to know any of this when I was there. Saw a similar kind of house that could have evoked what their lives might have been like, and I now know it probably was a street of settlement in which the Jews had lived there, but otherwise nothing. So I went off to Łódź. They had moved to Łódź, I would go to Łódź. And I went to the town, the city where they lived, at Tenzgerska Street. I had been there in 1981 to speak at a conference on industrial archaeology, and the people from Solidarność had taken me there because I was returning to my hometown. I have to tell you that as an American growing up in the United States, we never thought of ourselves as Polish. Because the stories, excuse me, we'd all been told was that this was a land simply that was hostile territory in which no one would be comfortable. Indeed, when I wrote this book, I would meet people all the time in the United States, and I'd say, "Oh, I'm going to Ukraine," or "I'm going to Poland," "I'm going to Berlin." And they'd say, "Why are you going to those places? Why would any Jew go to such places?" This, by the way, is the problem you have in running tourism. The people who come here with expectations that it was a graveyard or that they're full of just people who are anti-Semites. And I had to learn that it was not that by going to these places. So I went to Zagierska Street, and there was almost nothing there to be seen. Time. Went to the cemetery outside, the old cemetery, which again had nothing. This was a picture of my grandparents at their gravesite before the war. Now, what you see, of course, this is not their gravestone. It's just one in the woods that one would see in that cemetery. Nothing marked. No. The only grave that is marked is of the largest Jewish industrialist, Israel Poznansky. He has a big gravesite. So I went there. What I did find, of course, was Poznansky's manufacturing complex, which had been developed by a French company around 2002. It was the largest development project in Poland after the rebuilding of the old city in Warsaw. And they took the complex, and as you can see, they smarted it up. They fixed up, they repointed it. It now has several boutiques, it has a cineplex, it has a bank, it has a Jewish restaurant. The sluice, which was the water power system, now is a nice walkway. There's a merry-go-round in the middle. And there's a little museum on the 3rd floor with 2 little rooms of happy workers. But otherwise, it is now a shopping mall. But nearby was the Poznansky Mansion. The Poznansky Mansion is now the Museum of the City of Łódź. So I went there, and I met with the curator, and I said, "So this was also the site of the 1905-1907 revolt, the Bundes Revolution in Łódź. What do we learn of that story?" I think there we are with the curator in the Poznansky Mansion. And she said to me, "Well, to be honest, we see this as a story of the continuing legacy of Polish entrepreneurship. That's the story. We don't talk about the strike." So again, something of that history of everyday life, of socialists, of Yiddishkeit, nowhere to be seen in at least the commercial tourism that I experienced in those cities. So I gave up, decided I would see what I could find if I traveled and looked at the other side of my family, which was a grandfather who came from a village, some of you will know, town, just to the west, about 70 kilometers, I think, west of Lviv, Mushtik. He had left there when he was about 12 years old. I was told he had run away from home. His father was a moil, the Jewish ritual work, circumcisions for children who were born. And so he was a prominent family member. And so I went there with a tour guide to Mushtika, and again, found nothing that was marked, although the main square, like many of these towns, were squares in which Jewish shopkeepers, Polish shopkeepers, all worked side by side, cheek to jowl and all. But nothing was marked. There was no way to have any sense of what was going on, what had been there. There are historical photos that suggest something of the earlier part of that history. Synagogue, as late as '96. See, the guide I had. We saw buildings that seemed reminiscent of what was possible, but again, nothing was visible. I went then and stopped old-timers on the street and finally found somebody who said, oh, we think there's a guy whose mother was Jewish, so he's a Jew, and he works at the brick factory. So we walked to the brick factory, and we spoke to the woman who was behind the desk, and she said, oh yes, we know him, we'll get him for you. She calls him on his phone, and he comes. And he's given the rest of the day off. It was clear that he had done this before. And he drives us down a series of dirt roads for about 15 minutes, it seemed like. And we came to a small place where there was a gravestone, a memorial stone. And there were basically, it was what in films about Cambodia and Thailand they call killing fields. These were the Jews had been from the town had been brought together and buried in the background. And there were some stones. What there mostly were visible, of course, were the geese, the ducks. But I met with the other people who were, as it were, the last living Jews in Moshtika. There went on. So I, in fact, discovered very little. So in the rest of the book, I then decided, well, I'm going to see if I can learn more about the story by following the Jewish diaspora trail. So people like Max, my grandfather, Max Margell from Moshtika, they got on boats, and the boats left from places like Hamburg, and they stopped often in Southampton. So in Southampton, some got off and went to London, and they went to Leeds, and they went to establish Jewish communities in London. So I write about London, and then, like Max, many stayed on the boat, and they went to the United States. And so I write a chapter about New York. Now, both cities have very rich, especially New York, a very rich Jewish history, and in New York, there's a very rich socialist Jewish history that one could find. It's there, no question about it. But what I discovered in going there and talking on guided tours with others was that the Jewish history in these places had primarily had diminished considerably. That there were the leading tour guide in the city who runs a very big tour agency, probably the best tour guide company that I know in the world that I've experienced, called Big Onion Tours. Does a wonderful job training his people. They're all people who are historians and anthropologists and art historians, very knowledgeable, and he trains them well. He said, we only do 15 tours a year. People instead want to go on ghost tours. In London, they do Jack the Ripper tours. And now, increasingly, they want food tours. Or they do immigration history tours of the Lower East Side, but very few Jewish tours. Why? He said, well, after 1990, most of these young people who are coming there now want to instead go back to where they ran. After 1990, Eastern and Central European sites open up, and they want to go back to those sites to see, with their kind of inherited memories, what they can find of their grandparents' experiences. So in the second half of the book, I go back. And I go to Berlin, and then I go to Budapest, Bucharest, Belgrade, and then the last two chapters I go to the two cities that have the most robust Jewish heritage tourism, Krakow and Warsaw, to see what I can find. Well, what I do find is that there are cracks in this dominant narrative. If the dominant narrative, if the overriding story to be told is a heritage narrative, most dominant narratives have cracks. It's very hard to maintain them. Other people want to learn about other kinds of things. And I found a few cracks that in the story that to me were particularly illuminating and interesting. This was one. It's in Bucharest. It's of the Jewish theater in Bucharest. Again, the tour was primarily of Holocaust sites and synagogues, but suddenly we walk out on the street, the Jewish theater continues there. They were closed that day, but the actors came out. Only half of them actually know Yiddish. They simply memorize Yiddish words in order to perform, so they don't have enough people who speak Yiddish. But it's a vibrant sense of that Yiddish culture that always existed in those cities, and that was one place. The other place that I found it was in this museum, the Belgrade Jewish Museum, and it's of a kind of Jewish worker. It's a heroic image, comes with its own problems of a romanticized Jewish proletariat. Why is it there? Because the museum dates from the Tito era. Bucharest, its leader was so busy building monuments to himself, there was no money to build a new Jewish museum. In Belgrade, they were so busy bombing everybody and being bombed by everybody, they also had no money to build a new museum. So the museum is from the Tito era, and Tito's friends were Jewish partisans. They were in his government, and they played a major role, and he was willing to talk about them in a major way in the museum. So the museum was full of images about Jewish life before the war, in which there were Jewish theater groups, Jewish gymnasium groups, Jewish children being educated, Jewish women's groups, all as a part of that story. So in some ways, the two sites that had not been able to create what we would call modern museums were where I still found remnants of a different kind of story. But the main place one saw a new story was here, in Warsaw, at a museum called Poland. Why? Well, Poland was part of what I experienced as a new writing of Jewish history taking place in the middle of this last decade. It has earlier roots. Some of it goes back several decades. One of the pioneers of that writing is the woman who curates the central exhibit here, Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblin. She was a folklorist, an anthropologist, and really one of the leading figures in the study of Yiddishkeit in the world. And she goes back and takes up Polish citizenship. She's actually Canadian and American and Polish in terms of just citizenship. She's a citizen of the world. And she goes there, resides there, and helps to develop a museum which is not it is not a Holocaust museum. It is dedicated to 1,000 years of Jewish history in Poland. It is not a history of simply Jews in Poland. It is a history of Jews who are Polish in Poland. It tries to break down that binary between Poles and Jews in creating a narrative in which the Holocaust is one period. It is not the end point of the story. It's not a story that simply begins and ends of Jewish history in the Holocaust. And it is a history that she writes that has many ways to be Jewish. So, for example, in the floor that talks about Jewish life at the turn of the last century, they talk about Jewish education, and there are a series of tables like this. On each table, there's a monitor that you can use with your hand that is a computer monitor. And on one table, it is a curriculum for the Zionist curriculum. Another one is a Bundes curriculum. And there are 6 different curriculums reflecting the different ways in which there were different voices speaking about what it meant to have a Jewish education during that period. And it begins to give you a sense that there is no essential way simply a checklist to be Jewish in that kind of story. So it's a very powerful kind of piece. It's of a part with this new Jewish history that comes to be written. She is one of the leading figures. The others are people like Erica Lair, Michael Meng, and a wonderful guy, Scott Urey, who's written a book about the 1905 revolution of the Bundesrevolution in Warsaw. What do they demonstrate? Well, they first of all make clear that the history in Central and Eastern Europe has largely been a history that's been dominated by political history and intellectual history. So it is focused often on the story told by rabbis, intellectuals like Mendelssohn, and great entrepreneurs, wealthy men. He tries to argue that what is needed is a social history as well. And it is a social history in which synagogues continue to play a place, but so doomed it becomes, rather, they argue, essential is now the Jewish street is the central place. Thank you. So the Jewish street becomes central to this new Jewish history. Also argued, see if I can get my notes to clarify for you. That women are also central to the story. That many of the activists are not simply the men doing the story, but their wives, or the wives of their husbands, rather than making the possessive simply the men of the women, it's the women of the men. And the women are often doing the double day. They're both making food at home, caring for the children, and they're out on the streets. Rosa Luxemburg would be the famous example you would know, for instance, in the German story. There are loads of such stories, similar kinds of women, in the American labor movement, the Zionist, the political movement, the labor movement at the turn of the century, of people who self-describe themselves as Buddhists. So it is a gendered story and part of the narrative as well. So this new Jewish history helps to create a new narrative that is not one simply of what we would describe in the Holocaust of one of relentless victimization. It is a story in which Jews are activists, and they have agency and are telling the story of their own life. And it is not a story simply about the destruction of Jews. It is a story about the creation of a vibrant culture and a complex, complicated culture. It is the story that Jewish historians have already described about many of these cities. And they're arguing it now needs to be, they're describing that new kind of narrative. And Poland is a place where one begins to see that narrative. And it's become influential enough so that some of the Holocaust museums have since closed their exhibits with the intention to reopen. Budapest is such a museum where they're going to be opening again. There's a new impetus to do similar work in New York. The Berlin Museum also trying to rethink its exhibit based on what Poland has done. And this, by the way, is a project worldwide significance. I, earlier in September, was keynoting a conference in Krakow on urban Jewish heritage. There were people there from 31 countries who are involved with Jewish heritage in each of those countries. 31 countries. It is a worldwide activity. It's a worldwide business as well, with all of the problems that accompany that, too. And this is a new model, at least for many of these people, a new way of thinking about the making of the Jewish self, because the last piece I want to demonstrate that's important about this new Jewish social history is that it argues that the making of the modern Jewish self is forged in two major social movements of the late 19th and 20th century, Zionism and Bundism, or socialism. They're not distinct, they overlap, they're socialist Zionists, as you well know elsewhere. But these two social movements are movements in which people are trying, in response to this new industrial world to which Jews are moving from the villages, they're trying to find a way to create a space for themselves, an identity in which they can thrive and survive. And Bundism and Zionism are ways to create that kind of identity and that kind of place. So both become important, and of course they resonate with me because I'm trying to find that history of my grandmother, who was a Buddhist in that place. And suddenly I'm finding a literature that's saying, hey, it's not only there, it's actually central to the Jewish story, the modern Jewish story. So I go back to find it. And I find it, of course, here, but I find it also in other places. New guidebooks that are informing this new kind of history, one of which comes out of work being done by Elise Lieberman and the Taube Foundation in Warsaw, where they created new walking tours of both Warsaw, Krakow, and just recently of Łódź. And these are guidebooks that also make it possible to hear the pre-war history and a history of the streets. This is one such location we found in Plasski Square. So much of, as you know, of places like Warsaw it's a Holocaust site. It's like Berlin, it's a Holocaust streetscape. And what they have chosen to mark some things, in Warsaw, they show you the outline of the ghetto wall. So they've made decisions to recreate some things, but there are other things they can do as well. When I went on my walking tour, the walking tour guide never spoke about this. But the field guides that the Taube Foundation has developed takes you to places like this. And it tells a complicated, not unproblematic, but a complicated story about that place as well. Now I will tell you the challenge. Great guides. Hard for you to ever find it, however, and use it. Because when you go to the hotels, you arrive and say, oh, I think I'd like to do a walking tour. What do you find? You find live in my pocket, or Krakow in your pocket, or Łódź in your pocket. It's an international company that makes the tour guide that's in all the hotels, and it has a small walking guide, a walking tour usually in every one, and in almost every case, it's basically the Holocaust tour of the concentration camp, or the Jewish ghetto, and that's all it is. They don't have the field guides, and so they're very, very hard to find. So you've got to know to start asking for them. You've got to help make them become the centerpiece of the new kind of history that can be written. So there are possibilities to begin to do some of that. But the possibilities, I want to add, are challenging. And they're challenging because a couple of things I wanted to end by talking about. A series of conceptual notions that continue, I would argue, to plague, or at least challenge, I think, more appropriately, the writing of a more inclusive Jewish history. The first is the idea of the secular Jew, or assimilation. Assimilation, Jewish historians, others have now, is a term now which has become, in Jewish history writing, acknowledged to be a deeply problematic concept. It was a concept that emerges quite popularly as a way of, as a rhetorical device to argue some people are not a part of the story. When I went initially to Budapest, I said to one of the scholars, I'd like to learn more about my grandmother experience or people like that. He said, oh, you won't find them here. They all assimilated. They're no longer part of the story. Well, who is part of the story? Well, it brings me to the third point that I want to talk about, the Jewish community. If you go to, again, in Budapest, to the Jewish Museum, it's located in the Rohatyn synagogue. It is simply a series of religious artifacts, primarily, though it's now closed, and it's going to be more than that, they say, they hope soon. But when you go on tour, they simply say to you, well, it's controlled, it's actually owned and operated by the Jewish community, but they don't make clear to you who that is. I heard Jewish community, and I think, oh, it represents the Jews of Budapest. Well, how many Jews are there in Budapest? It's estimated anywhere from 100,000 to now as much as 150,000. How many people? The Jewish community is actually an organized group of people. Okay? They number several thousand, and they are the traditional religious community. They were organized in part because the states, after the outbreak, after the war, did not want to have to deal with Jews. And they said, we're going to hand over everything. We want a representative of the Jewish community to whom we can give you this material and let you be responsible for it. So Jewish groups were encouraged to, as it were, form a formal organization. And those are the organized Jewish community. It is equivalent as this, again, as the Jewish scholars I've read argue, and I think they're correct. It is largely the same, coterminous with the synagogue community. That doesn't speak to the small c Jewish community, which is made up of 150,000 people or 100,000 people rather than the 10,000 people. And the other people are largely secular. So it's partially about who gets to count in the story, who becomes part of the story, who gets to decide. That kind of story. That brings me to number 3. The number 2 there, the politics of philanthropy. Again, you go on tours, and they want to show you the great buildings that have been built. So what would be here? The hospital. Right? In other places, it'll be the old age home. It'll be X, Y, and Z, and they point out so-and-so gave the money. They were the philanthropists. And look how, in Vuj, it's Poznansky. He built the hospital. What they don't tell you is that he then deducted pay from all the workers to pay for it, work money that they were hard-pressed to find, and that's why they rioted against him. They might have wanted to use it elsewhere. And so the real issue is, who gets to call them philanthropists? What does it mean to be a philanthropist? How does that narrative get changed if we introduce into it notions about paternalism or about social control? Or how does the story change if they're called something? Who gets to name them? I was telling my colleagues over tea before we began that when I gave this lecture in New York a couple of weeks ago, a man came up to me afterwards. He says, "Oh, you know, my family is from Vuj, and every day they used to talk about Poznansky, and they'd go, Poznansky." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, we called him the bloodsucker." Well, I was thinking, well, how would the story be different if they said, well, the building was built by the bloodsucker Poznansky rather than the philanthropist Poznansky? I'm not saying they should or they shouldn't. It just means, how do you get people to think about the categories that are being inherited, created, and named, and who gets to do the naming about those experiences? And what happens when you open it up to say, well, how is the story different if it's told by the workers rather than by the owner? It's not unlike talking about slave monument, Confederate monuments. How is the story different when written by the slaves rather than by the Confederate soldiers in the United States? So it's the same kind of thing. And what I will say, again, that the museum in Poland tries to do is give you the sense of stories from different perspectives and how they all can be incorporated. And the last piece I want to talk about is one of the greatest challenges, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. It's what we call the fetish of the artifact. How do you write a history or take people on a walking tour when there's nothing to see? Well, the answer, I would argue, is there's always something to see. And sometimes it's the politics of space. And spaces have sedimented histories. People have lived there over generations. They don't have simply one history in which a Jew lived there, a Ukrainian lived there, a Pole lived there. They lived side by side. Something we were talking about earlier. And places have been marked. So I mentioned again the decision in Warsaw. They've marked the ghetto wall. They can mark other things as these stones. They're not simply in Berlin now, they're across all of Europe. They started in Berlin. They've been placed in front of the houses in which Jews lived. But they can be in front of the houses in which anybody lived. And they can begin to give you a sense of ordinary people and who lived there. It tells you simply when they were born, when they were brought to Auschwitz, and when they were deported. But it could also tell you their occupations. All different kinds of information can be transmitted. And you all know, of course, of sites that have historical markers on places. And we can do a lot of that. That doesn't solve the problem. You still have to ask who gets to tell the story on that marker. Okay? But you've already changed it by noting that somehow there may be a story in that place, and it may be a story that's equally significant, and not just because somebody with a lot of money lived there. Okay? It may have been somebody who did the work. So You might go to a large mansion, and it may be just as important to learn about not just who built the building and who the rich person was who provided the money for its building, but it might be important to learn about who actually worked in the building, the servants, or the experience of the wives and the children in the building. There are many more stories that can be brought out, and you can learn something about, well, where did this rich man get all his money? At Bloodsucker. Where did he get his money? Story. So it's possible. And can it be done? Well, that's one example on which it can be done. Here's the other example. This again is Gravesites Square. Two buildings side by side. The one on the right that you can barely see is now a condo. They are twin buildings. The one on the left has not been redeveloped by a developer. Okay? The one on the right has lost its historical meaning. It has a new meaning. Doesn't mean it doesn't have meanings. But the one on the left now has simply had pictures posted of the sort of people who either lived there or lived in the neighborhood. It's a model for what I would argue has been done most successfully on the Lower East Side in Manhattan in what's called the Tenement Museum. Okay. Full transparency, one of my students, I'm proud to say, helped fund it and built it. It's not an unproblematic space, but it suggests, again, how daily life, you can take over a building and take over rooms, and in a building like this, you can have 8 different rooms in apartments, each recreated to show the lives of a group of kinds of people who live there, different backgrounds at different moments in time. Kids love this stuff. Adults love this material. It isn't as if tourists find this boring. One of the complaints that you find all the time in tourism is, the guides, our tourists don't want to hear this. They'll find, and I don't think for a minute they don't love this kind of stuff, where kids can actually see what the life was like of other children. So it's all possible to be done. So there is a new history. It is being written. It is not unproblematic. The last example I give is from Krakow, the present. So one of the ways in which these sites have tried to move away from Holocaust tourism is they've moved into the present and future, not into the past. And they've moved into the present by wanting to argue and laud the fact that there are these new festivals of Jewish cultural life. And they're in many of these cities, usually in the summer. 10-day long festivals. And you can buy knishes, you can buy Jewish food, you can learn something about Jewish folk dance and music, learn some Yiddish, and even learn something of the history in the past. But they're all meant to be, so who goes to these things? Well, they discover large numbers of them. People who are there are non-Jews. Perfectly fine. It is in fact but the complaints that are then made is that there's a kind of invention of Judaism going on. Well, I argue that's useful because we're always inventing and reinventing. What makes you think it's special that it's only being invented now? That doesn't solve the problem. You then interrogate that invention and reinvention. That reminds us, for me, the salient lesson from much of this is that there are many different ways to be Jewish. The Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox rabbis in Israel will have one set of lessons in a checkbox, and most of us would not make it in. But there are other ways in which someone like Woody Allen can still reflect Jewish culture. Freud, lots of other figures in our culture, part of that story. These figurines are built as part of the Krakow, and they're part of what's often thought to be the kind of Disneyfication. That's the complaint that's made about a popular commercialization of the culture. In this case, there are carvers who are making small figurines of Jewish musicians and others. The problematic one, Erica Lehrer, this anthropologist from Canada, has written a book called The Lucky Jew. And one of the figurines that she focuses on in that book is a figurine of basically a Jewish moneylender or a Jewish Shylock figure. Again, just a small figure that she argues and explains that Poles are buying in large numbers to put in the hallway of their house, much like Jews put a mezuzah in their house as an opening it. They're putting it there to bring them good luck. I think the invocation of a Shylock figure is kind of deeply problematic. But there are other people who point out that these carvers have been doing this for decades, if not for a century. They also make images of fat Poles. They make caricatures of everybody in different ways. That doesn't mean that the caricatures don't slip sometimes into rather brutal representations with other kinds of meanings. So it just makes problematic this kind of invention and reinvention that's going on at the same time in this kind of history. And the last picture, at least with the little slideshow, I went to Buenos Aires. So part of the discovery and rediscovery in this book is I went to Buenos Aires and found a second cousin. He is a professor like myself. My name is Daniel, but I go by the name of Danny. His name is Daniel. He goes by the name of Danny. He spells his name a little differently. He's my doppelganger. We are the two Danny Walkowitzes. So this story comes with all kinds of surprises from your story. And let me go back to where I began, my grandmother's story. And so part of this new history was also to go back and see, well, what was I missing in the narrative about my grandmother and my grandfather? And I'd been told that my grandfather was this rather majestic, noble figure. He was a tailor, but he ran the Yiddish theater. He was involved in creating the Jewish folk chorus. He had a house always welcome and inviting to the intelligentsia that came into town. And my grandmother, I was told, was mostly a homebody. And when I wrote one of my cousins say, well, what do you remember? He says, oh, I remember she was always surly. She was always complaining. She was never a very happy person. Well, I then found some oral histories written by my aunt and my uncle. And I found with songs and other things that they had sung from the Jewish folk chorus. And what did I learn? Well, I learned a few things. One was that my grandfather was, in fact, the remarkable man that I had heard he was. And indeed, when they were in Copenhagen, they had become friends, briefly, with Shalom Aleichem, who passed through Copenhagen on his way from Europe just before he died in the United States in 1915. And he came to the United States, and then in the United States, my grandfather did create this folk chorus and the theater and all the other things he did. But I also learned that he was a brutal child beater, that he disagreed with my father politically. They were both leftists, but leftists often eat their own. They fight amongst themselves. And he regularly beat my father so badly that my grandmother had to intervene to get him to stop. Now let me remind you that patriarchy in our culture is not so unusual, and it's not limited just to Jews. So there were lots of people who beating was not as uncommon. That doesn't make it any better. But it was a part of the story. And it reminded me that patriarchy and the Jewish family was also integral to the survival of the story. And it came up, it became apparent to me as well in learning some things about my grandmother. She was not simply this dour, shy woman. She did, as I suggested before, the double day. When my grandfather was busy out on strike, she made sandwiches and sold them at lunchtime to struggling workers so she could hold the family together when there was no money. She raised all of these children. She raised money for families out on relief in the 1930s during the Depression. She raised money for, after the war, for families that were resettling after the Holocaust. And then in 1955, I learned from my uncle, she was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, which we know is part of the McCarthy campaign. I had not known this story. And my uncle telling this story, he's a storyteller, so I can't be sure that it's 100% accurate, but it rings of truth. He says he had to go because she only spoke Yiddish and he would translate. She goes before the committee and they say, Mrs. Walkowitz, what magazines do you read? And she said, I can't read. Now, I know that she can read Yiddish, and I have letters from her. Okay? So she's either lying or she's interpreting the question and meaning, can you read English? So they say, Mrs. Walkowitz, let us rephrase the question. What magazines do you subscribe to? She says to my Uncle Joe, she says, did they think I'm such a fool that I subscribe to things I can't read? The interview then ends, and she says to Joe, remember, these are terrible inquisitors that she's dealing with. They're very scary people. with the capacity to ruin your life. She says, Joe, you can tell them they can go home and sleep tonight. I'm not going to throw any bombs. The point is, this was not a shrinking violet or a shy woman. She was somebody who was helping to hold the family together. And it made clear to me how our history has to be, not only has to include the stories of Jews, it has to be a new story. That is an inclusive story, that is also a story that is deeply gendered. So this is much of the voyage of discovery for me, as I hope it has been in sharing it with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny, and it's my pleasure to bring Marla and Jay to the table. And as we were listening to traveling and visiting by Daniel Walkowitz, it is also important for us to think that it is a part of new Jewish history, but it's also global history. So many people traveled. I mean, they traveled in search of a better life, of better chances, and this area where the city of Lviv is a part of has been tremendously marked by people living at the end of the 19th and the 20th century to different places. And nowadays, so many of their descendants, their children, children of their children, children of their children, are coming and bringing these different worlds to their visits. And this is where the place comes through. And while Danny took us through the traveling, I would like to and living this experience of finding places, I would like to invite Marla and Jay to talk how from traveling you go into living, but most of all to working in the places. And here I have to add that Marla and Jay founded an NGO called Rohatyn Jewish Heritage, and are engaged in working in Rohatyn, but also in Lviv and other places, and see this story of people looking for their ancestors' homes while being at home here. So I would like to refer to what Danny's story is, but Danny's story is a story of a historian and a story of somebody who is traveling and searching, departing from New York and going to all these places. You left San Francisco at some point, and you are here on the welcoming part, on the part of meeting people. And I would like to share and also bring this very different perspective, I think, which is very pertinent to us gathered in this room. So if Marla, you could please tell, the mic is there, and how this change, I mean, this experience of moving and being here and living, changed your perspective on Jewish heritage tourism, on heritage, and on things Jewish. Yes.
Wow.
Wow.
That's expensive.
I think you can pick up some parts.
Let me just first say that it wasn't a direct San Francisco to Lviv. We've been living in Europe for most of the last 20 years, and in fact, prior to Lviv, we lived in Warsaw for 2 years working on Jewish heritage. And in fact, Danny's, one of his first slides of his cemetery is owned by the foundation I worked for in Warsaw. But also like Danny, our travels, including ending up here in Lviv, were precipitated by a desire to, the entry point was family history. And very much like Danny, we have my family has a lot of crossover points with his in New York and over here. It was my inspiration to come. And a lot of the travel I had done up into coming to Lviv was tracing the footsteps of family members prior to them going to New York in 1914. What has changed? There's no question that heritage tourism is a huge business and it's growing. We've seen it just our first visit to Lviv was in 2008. In 2011, 3 years later, we moved here for 3 months. We came back again a few years later for a few months, and now we're back permanently into our 3rd year. And it's amazing how much has changed. Lviv in particular, the fact that I can hear, for example, one of the biggest changes is I hear a lot of Polish tourism on the streets now that even 2 years ago I didn't hear. Preceding Polish tourists were Jewish tourists. I saw plenty of Israelis. I heard Hebrew and English, but I never heard Polish. Now I hear Polish all the time. Last summer in Rohatyn was an enormous tour bus from Poland that disgorged 20 or 30 people to visit the Polish heritage in Rohatyn, where my grandmother's from. And the question is sustainability, attractiveness. Some of these issues have been touched on already. How do you show people the Jewish history of a place when there's nothing to show? That's the story of Rohatyn. The empty spaces are where the synagogues were. The empty space is where the cemeteries were. The empty space is where the mass graves are. But we're not wanting to focus on the Holocaust. How do you attract people to visit Rohatyn, to look upon the Renek, to look upon the streets, and imagine what it was like before the war, because much of the city was destroyed and rebuilt. So it requires a lot of imagination. It's hard to get people motivated and excited looking at something that's not architecturally interesting, but has a history, or as an empty space, imagining what was there when you don't have photographs to even show them what was there. So these are the challenges for activists on the ground. Also, for most Jewish visitors, it's a one-time visit. They're not likely to come back again. They're not likely to engage with us for the long term, to want to support the care, the relationships we've developed with students and teachers in the city. So who carries on beyond us? Because we're not young chickens. And we can't afford indefinitely to be funding these projects, but likewise, I'm not saying inheritors out in the wings. I do believe for the long term, all heritage requires partnerships of not just the diaspora, but absolutely local residents, historians, teachers, academics. And we see a small amount of that in Rohatyn, but if tomorrow we stop going, is it sustainable? I don't know. It's all very fragile, actually.
So let me answer your question about transformation, telling Marla's story, which I know well, but this will link to your story as well. In 2011, you visited a number of places, one of which was Mostiska. In 2011, we were living in Lviv and visiting Rohatyn, still as family historians. So imagine in 2011, you visit Mostiska and you find the cemetery. And you see in the cemetery there's little more than geese. And then you walk back in toward the center of town and you meet someone and he learns you're Jewish. And he says, oh, I have something to show you. And by the side of the road, he shows you a large fragment of a Jewish headstone that belongs in the cemetery but isn't in it. And then he says to you, what do you want us to do? Okay, so suddenly now you have a responsibility, exactly, which you can walk away from, and we've watched other people walk away from it in other towns, and of course it isn't really your responsibility. But it's a problem, and it seems like a problem, and because we were living in Lviv at the time, we decided, well, it's just a headstone. You know, we'll pay a tiny bit of money so that some labor can be found and take it to the cemetery, take it back to the cemetery. The man who approached Marla about this, was satisfied with that. Okay, there's someone now again who is a link that we can talk to when we have Jewish heritage problems in town. But that one headstone, over the course of that first spring and summer we were here, turned into a dozen and then 2 dozen. And through that year, the 5 months that we lived here that year, it turned into 50 or 60 or something. And after 8 years, it's 500 fragments. And something needed to be done. And these 500 fragments from a Jewish community of 3,000 plus people at any one time, there should be many thousands of headstones, most of which were broken into pieces. So we figured there's more than 10,000 fragments out there somewhere. And we found 500. So this is a big job. And anyway, our thinking obviously changed about our relationship with the city, our relationship with the people who live there, our relationship with the Jewish descendants like Marla, who also either their ancestors left before World War II or the very small number who survived World War II in town. And so we have a relationship with those people as well, but there's no formal organization except our NGO, and our NGO is just the 2 of us. So anyway, that transformation.
But you have many partners because you've got partnership with school. You also got connections with people who publish local newspaper. And you visit classes with young people there. And also your scope of diaspora got also very violent because people who are also coming from Poland, or sometimes on Facebook, somebody coming from Ukrainian diaspora.
Actually, the Ukrainian diaspora has turned out to be the most unexpected benefit of the last 2 years because they've reached out to us.
And it also shows us that there is this, there are many diasporas for these places. You hardly can say that these are Ukrainian diaspora, because when we speak Ukrainian diaspora, we pretty much understand that these are people who have speak or spoken Ukrainian and are connected to ethnically, have ethnic. But if you zoom into a place, you actually can think how many diasporas a place has. It has Jewish diaspora, it has Ukrainian diaspora, it has Polish diaspora, and people are coming. And they're also looking for, for recognition. And this is what also then you are looking for symbolic marker of presence, of actually something that says that this is not a forgotten story. And it's true that, that the obvious marker is our synagogues and cemeteries, or their absences, rather their ruins. So this materiality. But at the same time, I was also wanted to ask you, how, and bridging to this word of responsibility, but taking to the relevance, because what kind of markers you would expect in places which is not as big as Polin Museum, because it's huge, right. It's exceptional. But also what kind of markers you could envisage, and how you see that, whose responsibility that could be, and how, in a way, to make this, or make the making of the markers relevant to the people who are in Lutz, because your story mainly is on the tourism and business, but there is also a sphere around, or should we rely on tourism and business in this? So how is your proposal with your experience also in revisiting American history?
I'm not sure I have an easy answer.
No, it's never is.
2 quick thoughts. One is that there is a difference that's not not been easily bridged between thinking of ourselves as writing about a place and about a group. So if you're doing reconstructing the life of Rohatyn, then it's many peoples over time. If your project is reconstructing the lives of the Jews who left, that's a different project. But it seems to me that what we come to know and appreciate is that you really can't do the second without at least acknowledging the sphere of the first. So the example we gave is if they were to mark a building on which a Jewish family lived, but people there know that, well, lots of other families lived there in their time as well. So I think that the easiest, one thing of course is to mobilize the local community so it's their history. Now, it's their history of the city. They have to understand that in writing about the Jews who lived in Rohatyn, they are writing about their history of Rohatynians, whatever they are, right? Of it, rather than thinking that they're writing about the other. They're writing another way about themselves and about their own story. And that's harder to do. Sometimes I think the easiest way to do it, the groups that are engaged, if you're working with them, it sounds to me exactly the right, it's the schools. That the children can get incredibly engaged in doing this kind of work and involved in it in some ways maybe more easily than even their parents can. And then the teachers, so I was thinking about, yes, a group comes and often we don't go back to the same villages. Well, I've been to that museum. How often do we go back to the same museum unless it's a famous art museum? We don't often. But the teacher goes back probably year after. You may go back with many different groups over years, so you can build a relationship maybe through that teacher and the groups that go back as one way.
Yeah, actually I'd like to just quickly address this because I absolutely agree with you. Teachers and students in particular, young people that we've met are incredibly curious and they're asking all the right questions. The biggest challenge is they leave. We've lost our two key teachers who were teaching English and history in Rohatyn in the last few years. They've emigrated. They've emigrated to Canada.
These are the people in Rohatyn, these are teachers in the city, right?
Yes. And right now, what we're trying to mobilize is new relationships with some of the students because we have an American Peace Corps volunteer who's working with students in Rohatyn, and it looks promising. But it's too soon to tell. We'll find out in May when we have our first collaborative project, and my fingers are crossed.
So my granddaughter had a project in school in which she was told to write a story or invite grandparents to talk about where she came from. And she decided it was Denmark because my father was born in Copenhagen. There obviously is, you're an example of it, there's a diaspora community from Rohatyn, and it may well be that one can try to establish connections with those children to get them and through their teachers to come back as another way of time to the community.
Yes, it's just that, the amount of task and what to do is so huge, and the number of resources and commitment and time is limited, and we constantly have to navigate or oscillate without thinking that this is hopeless, but also without thinking that it can be done very quickly.
Sure, and I think leaving an internet footprint is very important, and that's something we're working on, that our NGO website will be a resource for future people who would come along, both for understanding the history that we've uncovered through interviews with Ukrainians, Jews, Poles, etc., memoirs, academic works, etc., maps that show pre-war location of houses and cemeteries, synagogues, Beit Midrash, churches, schools. And so, Jay comes from an IT background, and my first reaction to that was, nah, but I do now think to have, what's really important is to leave a legacy that will hopefully persist beyond us, and the internet is one way to do that. So that what we've done and what we've collected over the 8 years in terms of documentation and photos, etc., will at least be available for those who come along later.
And I think that this is crucially important because it allows people to tap into the stories you haven't heard, into the parts of information which is not your family story, because we tend to focus on what we care about, family story, our story, but also how to stumble across other family story and how to and then start to making some connections and then ask questions. And this is the moment where I would like you to ask some questions. Možná ukrajinskую. You can all comments because this is also maybe this is an experience that some of you had in different ways of being a tourist, or of seeing a tourist, or getting encountered with tourists and tourism and in connection to heritage. So we have some time. Ira, please.
Thank you so much for this presentation. And my question is exactly about how you approach and how you maybe appropriate or interact with the voices or experience of all those tourists whom you observe. So actually, on the one hand, of course, you are critical about this commercialization and very superficial approach of this standardized tours taken by most of people. But on the other hand, how do you avoid being a kind of, I don't know, dominating or I think being a kind of knowing more than these people know, or what is your approach to this? So was it a kind of closer observation of the tourists and tourist practices, or aren't you afraid of also repeating a kind of the experience in a sense, because you are also a tourist in this place? So how do you see this? Thank you.
Well, to be sure, I'm a tourist on these places. But in this project, in most instances, there were a few exceptions. This was a kind of participant observation, and I was passive. I simply, like them, simply went along. I didn't privilege myself in that. I was mostly interested in getting a sense of where they came from. I mean, I did do a little kind of survey with them just to see where they were coming from and what their expectations were. But on the whole, I did not identify myself, and I simply listened to what the tour itself was doing and tried to get a sense of observing what is the age cohort, how many are women, how many are men, are they young, are they Jewish, are they non-Jewish, and what brought them to these tours. But in most cases, that's all. I wasn't there to judge them so much as to hear what they could learn from the experience.
Any questions? Any comments? Observation to share?
I'm just going to mention two things. One is I have some leaflets here. If anybody wants the book at a 20% discount, they can use that leaflet, and that's a cheaper way to get this. The other thing I was going to mention, the website is Virtual Shtetl, which is a wonderful website that gives people an opportunity to learn about villages all through Central and Eastern Europe, like this.
So that's Julie.
Danny, maybe you'd like to talk about the curators, because it wasn't just you and the tourists, right? Or just you and the guys.
Well, I've shared with people on other occasions. The curators are, if anyone, I suppose, the heroes of my story. I've found they're well trained, they're smart, they're intelligent. I often found they were very receptive to what I was interested in. They felt constrained often. They have to raise money. They have to be concerned with exit interviews, what brings people there, who will come back. And they need to find ways to do all of that. They have to be concerned about the role of politicians who want to make sure that certain people are not blamed in the story. So that in Poland, for instance, well, in Hungary in particular, I met curators who had been fired because they refused to change their exhibit to make clear that Hungarians bore no responsibility for the Holocaust. These were people who had integrity and refused to do that and simply resigned. So they have their own rather extraordinary sets of constraints often in what they can do. I think the main call I would have, two things, is that what Holocaust tourism tried to do was to remind people that we must never forget. And I guess my lesson is that they're right, but we must never forget needs to be broadened. It is not simply about the experience of the Holocaust that we must never forget. It's about there was in fact a lived history that is much larger than the Holocaust. So I would simply maintain that call, but very much broaden it. It is a much broader call. The second piece, though, is to say that I think curators, the real responsibility they have and role that they can begin to play is in working not just with the local community, but with the tour guides, with the docents. Some of these museums are very small and they have limited resources, but some are much larger. Some can work with local schools in developing serious historical studies, not just of Jewish studies, Ukrainian studies, Russian studies, opening up those provinces. So they're also not limited and kind of ethnocentric programs. And they can do a real serious job of training the docents and the tour guides who are hungry for work. I mean, tourism is booming in part because these are cities that have lost their old manufacturing base. This is where the jobs are. The tourist industry is where jobs are. So we bear a responsibility for helping to tool these people, give them the tools to do that work. And I think the people at the front line for that project are the curators. They're the ones who really are they're the ones who can both be attacked if they say something by groups, whether they can be Jewish tourists. And, there isn't one Jewish tourist. You can please one and find three others who are furious with what you do. And the same thing can be true of every other community, and that's a tough job for the curators.
I mean, curators is among new profession in Ukraine, which means
and
that
poorly paid.
Many of them.
They need to be paid better.
And that means also that there is a lot of work, but also a lot of stress on that, on stress on resources, and people are living. However, I think that if we talk about tourism and commercial, we also have to be aware how we are staying critical, but not getting too elitist and also too judgmental. In a way, the same we do with popular culture. It is tremendously important. Heritage tourism, Polish, Jewish, roots tourism, which would include Ukrainians coming, actually they do, by even the fact that people are walking and talking through the streets of cities, they do open or make cracks in this narrative, this dominant narrative, because somebody might be annoyed, somebody might be curious, somebody will ask, there's also no way of which creates chains of various reactions and responses. But that's also the question, where we take it from, and whether tourism is it's important business, an important activity and professional activity, that it needs to have a whole infrastructure around it, which includes schools that you mentioned, that includes universities, museums, people where there would be curators, visitors, people working in different capacities. And you talked about Jewish history a lot, but I think that the second big part of our conversation was social history. I mean, you talked about socialist tradition, Bund in particular, but also what was a bigger part, it was social history. And I think that for the history of place, and in Ukraine in particular, it is important to recover the potential of social history, which has decades of being ideologized. We can pick up the books from 60s and 70s, and this is about, toiling people and the workers, and it is the history exactly not against the bloodsuckers. So we also have this story or legacy of social history which was manipulated and ideologized and propagandized and kind of became shallow and refuted, thrown. It takes time, and I think that we gradually, slowly see how social, not as only workers' history, but which is workers, peasants, but not only, I mean, women, age-wise, we're getting the story better because that is actually what allows us to see who might have been our ancestors, even if you don't see their traces because most of our ancestors probably 100 years ago were not even literate, and they did not left any diaries, and the only record was if they got into trouble, and the state took the record of them. But that doesn't mean that the absence of record, which brings to the artifact, that the artifact is something that we have the power of interpretation. And there was a wonderful lecture several years ago here about from Professor Rabinowitz, who actually taught about curating an exhibition on slavery in New York, and saying that there were no materials, visual materials to put into the exhibition, because it all was about, you know, people who were slaves didn't have much of record, didn't have things which would be precious enough to keep in museums. So when you go into the storage of museum, you need to tell the story of slaves in New York, and you don't have much. But then, you know, he said, what is the question? You look at the mirror, a beautiful mirror, golden frame. And that's the question, is whose story this mirror is telling? A story of a person who bought it, or a story of a person who cleaned it to have it shiny every day or every other day. So this is not only about, you know, what objects we see, but also the power of our imagination and sensitivity to see things which we can't regularly see. And I think that this is part of your job, your writing, putting stones, doing map, and probably all of us to keep eyes open. And this is the last moment, and you can also raise your hand, and for the last question, your question.
Thank you. Hello there. I don't know if you're...
Doesn't work.
Okay, it doesn't work. That's okay.
You're up.
Okay. I've been listening to your lecture with vivid attention, and I want to tell something about the remembering. Okay, I'm Argentinian, second generation. My grandparents were born in Lviv, Lemberg at the time, at the beginning of the century. And they emigrated to Argentina in 1924, before the war, the Second War. So, this is my first time here. I'm an artist. I'm doing a work that I'm going to present it in Lviv in October. And this is my first research. I'm the first person that comes to Lviv from all my family. I'm the representative of my family. My grandparents passed away. And what I can tell you about my experience so far, I've been here 10 days only, is that the sense of feeling home, by looking and discovering that the food the locals eat is the food I ate in my grandfather's mother's house. And this relates to home. So I felt home here, in a way. And this is something I want to capture, you know. This, it's a mixture with who am I, with my heritage, okay. Part of the family was remained here they were killed in the Second War, and a little bit, I know, almost nothing. I'm trying to search for my family. I have a very hard time doing that here. I search for some things, a little bit I know, but what I want to reflect in my work is what was here before the war, a vivid community, merging with other communities, and this is what is important for me, okay? Because the war we already know what happened afterwards. There is, of course, we don't forget. It's our duty not to forget, but we want to recapture what was the life before. And my grandparents left this place because of the pogroms, but because they wanted to, you know, to go on like many other people at that time, to make their fortune in other continents. But the stories I have from my grandparents, they are of happiness. little things, customs, and this is what remained with me. And I think this is important to tell.
Thank you for sharing this and for making making crib here and coming here. And it's also, it's a very complex and simple question of belonging. What does that mean? And then this emotion comes, and before the emotions it comes. So I think that we will, at this point, we will thank Danny for your work, for your book, and for your talk today, and Marla and Jay for your work here today, tomorrow, and persistence here. This is part of stubbornness. And thank you for coming and being with us today here. Thank you.